Welcome to the Building Science Podcast.
Welcome to the Building Science Podcast.
Bringing the human factor to construction, design, and architecture. Brought to you by Positive Energy in Austin, Texas.
Okay, hello everyone and welcome back. I'm Kristof. This is the Building Science Podcast. And today I'm really delighted to introduce to you a special guest. His name's Adam Reiser. And we're going to be talking about moisture control in buildings. And those of you that have heard the podcast before know that this will not be a new subject for us. In fact, I think you've probably heard us talk about NIH saying that of the pollutants in buildings that are known to be causal factors for asthma, humidity is the top of the list. That was in February of 2015 that came out. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Adam Reiser. Adam, please introduce yourself and tell us a little about yourself.
Well, hey, thanks, Kristof. It's nice to be here. So I'm Adam. We have a company here in Austin called Shelter, which we started a couple years ago to build healthier houses. I kind of fell into that world. It's definitely not my background. And like so many people, you know, kind of the accidental things that happen to you in life, the flukes, the curveballs that the world and life throws at you were actually how we ended up there. But,
right.
You know, I have a real interest in trying to have a bigger conversation amongst all of us, amongst people who are living inside, which is most of us.
Most of us.
People who build inside environments, and all the industries and scientific, you know, research areas that are around and affect indoor environments, indoor air, in trying to, you know, move the ball down the proverbial field and help us move into just a more intelligent built space.
Right.
And so for me, that's something that started really personally.
How so?
Well, you know, we got sick off our home, and that was something that I never ever thought was possible. I mean, we bought in 2007 a really beautiful 30,000 square foot ranch house overlooking downtown Austin. You know, we saved up for a long time.
How many
for
square feet?
3,000 square feet.
It's a pretty big house.
Pretty nice house. Yeah, there were whole rooms we never went into. I mean, it was more than we needed for me and my wife and our Great Dane. No kids at the time. But you know, fast forward 5 or 6 years, we had a little girl. And then a couple years later, I started getting these bizarre symptoms. I started having food allergies I never had before. I mean, I had an iron stomach, could eat anything, anywhere, anytime, and all of a sudden I couldn't eat all these foods that...
Interesting.
Some of the obvious candidates, things like gluten, soy, and, you know, things that are sometimes irritants to a lot of people, but they've never been irritants to me. And that developed, and then I had all these other inflammatory conditions. My body was clearly just fighting something that I didn't know what it was, and you know, I tried every possible way to figure out what was going on. Every doctor you can imagine, every specialty, every clinic. Went to the Mayo Clinic, you know, kind of the gold standard, and everybody effectively gave me a clean bill of health. I was in my mid-30s. I was an athlete. You know, they couldn't find anything wrong with me, and when you're sick, that's just about the most frustrating thing possible. It's almost worse to not know what's going on when you're feeling bad than it is, you know, to have a diagnosis and then you have maybe you can plan a course of treatment and a course of action.
Right, so they're effectively telling you it's psychosomatic.
I mean, some version of that. I mean, not really. They're not saying you're just making it up, but they said we don't know. I mean,
well, if it was not, they couldn't measure anything that was pointing them to fix you. Interesting.
So that went on for 2.5 years, and then finally,
2.5 years.
It was a long, not fun journey. Really, you know, quality of life going down.
That is a big deal.
And then May 15th, 2013, I was walking down the street in New York City with my partner, Rip Esselstyn, who was there to be on the Today Show, and all of a sudden I found myself not being able to walk in a straight line. I kept on curving to the left like I had 5 beers and I couldn't hold the line. And I thought I had Alzheimer's. I mean, I didn't know what to think. It was a really scary, definitive moment in my life. And so I went home and had gotten the name of a doctor here in Austin named Ann Shippey, who a friend of mine had told me dealt with a lot of kind of things that nobody else can figure out. Saw Ann, and she effectively took one look at me and said, "I think you have a mold problem," which I immediately discounted and blew off because it was like, how, from where? I had two spaces I worked in. One was Whole Foods Market downtown Austin, which is a relatively new building that didn't seem like it had any issues. And then my house, which was this beautiful house that didn't smell like grandma's house. And
so there was no musty odor?
Oh, no, not at all. It was, you would never have guessed. No one would have walked in that house and thought there was a problem. So the way that you test for, I mean, really, it's not just mold. I mean, mold was not what she said it was wrong. She said, I think you have a mycotoxin. So
can you help me understand what a mycotoxin
sure. So
is?
myco is mold. It's, I think, Latin for mold, or whatever the root is.
Like mycelium, that's a part of the mold growth cycle.
Absolutely. So some molds, not all, but some molds spit out these mycotoxins that are basically used to create space for them. So if mold A and mold B are next to each other and they're both competing for territory to grow on whatever it is, tree bark, wood, the inside of your walls, and mold A wants to kill off mold B so it has more room to expand, it starts spitting out a mycotoxin and kills mold B or a virus or a bacteria.
So it's like a little chem bio weapon.
It's natural selection at its finest.
Oh my goodness.
It really is. And mycotoxins are powerful. I mean, penicillin is produced from penicillium. And if you remember the story of how penicillin was discovered.
Something blew in through the window.
And there was a petri dish, and all of a sudden there was nothing growing in this circle. And then, it was like, wait a minute, what is that stuff? Because it's creating this barrier for everybody else to get in. But penicillin.
That stuff was mold, right?
Penicillin is penicillin is a mycotoxin created by penicillium, which is a mold, and it's revolutionized medical history in the last century and saved millions of lives. So, just as a reference point of how powerful these things can be, I mean, one of the great medicines in the last 200 years is a mycotoxin used for human benefit. But not all things that we ingest are beneficial, especially when we don't know we're ingesting them. So she thought I had a mycotoxin. And that was her experience. And I got so lucky, Kristof, because I happened to be sitting in front of a doctor who had actually been through a mold problem herself.
Oh, my goodness.
So unlike any other physician I had ever talked to, and really some of the best of the best of the best across a spectrum of specialties, none of them had any personal experience. And you don't learn this in medical school. And that may be in and of itself as a separate podcast.
Yes, that's a very interesting topic.
But the reality is, it's not necessarily doctors' faults, Western medical allopathic doctors' faults, because this is not part of their training. They aren't trained to look for this as a cause of disease of any kind.
Right.
And so how would they know it really can be?
Or what the symptoms are.
Absolutely. And Anne just happened to have been through this herself as a physician, and she almost became a physician because of this.
Wow.
She had her own problem and had to figure it out. She went to medical school because she was an engineer and she was a problem solver.
So she was an engineer and then she became a doctor.
Yeah. So anytime you have an engineer who turns into, and you have to have a doctor who was an engineer before, it's always big, fat, 2 thumbs up as a good background for solving problems. So she wanted me to take a $700 blood test for, actually a pee test for mycotoxins. And I resisted because I'd been down so many fishing expeditions that dead-ended that I was just kind of broke. But finally, 3 months later, when I still couldn't walk in a straight line.
So you didn't say yes?
No, I said no way. I said, that's not it. That's not it. And so I waited, and finally I came back with my tail between my legs, and I said, okay. And I tested it, and I tested myself. And the test is a relatively accurate test that basically tests for 3 different types of mycotoxins, which are the only 3 we can test for. They're trichothazine, aflatoxin, and ochratoxin. Those are the 3 that kind of modern science can test for.
Do we have a sense how many we think there are that we test for these 3?
We think there are hundreds and potentially thousands.
Hundreds.
I mean, it's the proverbial tip of the iceberg in a really scary way, because we don't even know what's out there.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously molds have been around, for eons before we've been around, and we've come to coexist with them, for many, many years, thousands of years as mammals. The problem is that molds are a problem of concentration, and the toxins that they can, not all, but some of them can produce when they're trying to, do their thing and produce and spread just like we're trying to spread as a creature. When they do that, it can be a problem because inside we get these concentrations built up that outside would just dissipate into the air. So it's really an indoor problem in a funny way, and it's really why we're here. And so I came back with this test, and a positive, a negative test was on the scale that they did, a 0.8, and a positive was a 1. So it was a 0.2 differential between a negative and a positive. My score was a 22.2.
Oh my goodness.
So it was some version of 60 times higher than the differential between a negative and a positive. So I was just off the charts. Which, even though it was a horrible thing to find out, it was so liberating in that moment. It was like, okay, this is what has been wrong with me. Thank God. Like, oh my God, I have something I can point to. And now we have a problem to solve. So immediately we tested our house, because that was where we spent most of our time. And
how does that test go? Sample?
Same kind of thing. They collect dust. I mean, it's not a perfect science, and there's room for lots of better tests to do this. But when you're testing for something very specific and you know what you're looking for, it's actually much easier than it is when you're just kind of fishing for what's in the air or what's in your house.
Right.
So they collected dust. You collect dust on, basically a big, some version of a hybrid of a tissue, and you send it to a lab and they identify it. But and we also tested our air, and we did a bunch of tests. But at the end of the day, the house came back effectively just as bad as I was for a house. It's a different test, obviously, but same trichothecene was identified. So we knew it was the house. So we moved out that day. We took my wife and my daughter and our Great Dane, and we moved into family's house that day. And we never went back into the house. All of our possessions were in the house. Everything we owned after a lifetime of accumulating stuff. And, I remember the next day my wife and I had a very emotional, hard conversation in the front yard, thinking about, all right, what are our options? We can either sell our home, and we have to obviously tell, we're not going to just let someone move into a house that's got a neurotoxin floating outside the walls. That would be a little bit horrible.
So you just switched from mycotoxin to neurotoxin.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So I should have gone back. So those three mycotoxins I talked about, trichothecene, aflatoxin, and octotoxin, there's, luckily, at least for us, there are two different kinds of compounds. They're not organic. I mean, they're inert. They're chemicals. Aflatoxin and octotoxin are both carcinogenic compounds, and
oh my goodness.
In labs, actually, aflatoxin is used very commonly to turn on cancer production in rats and laboratory mice. It's a great cancer-starting agent, so it's used very, very commonly as a means of making cancer grow. We had a little bit of one of them, but not much. We had a little bit of octotoxin in our house. Aflatoxin is really, of all of them, it's probably the worst one to have. Trichothecene is a neurotoxin, so it attacks the immune system. And that explained a lot of what was going on with me, because all these food sensitivities, most of your immune system's in your gut. Most of your immune system is your microbiome and the bugs in your gut that really dictate a lot of our health and longevity. And, the neurotoxin obviously attacks your brain as well, and that's why I couldn't walk straight, why I had brain fog, memory loss, all these things that are so hard to diagnose. And it's always, looking back, it's easy to understand why Western medicine just missed it.
Yeah.
Because they're just not looking for that causation or that effect. So,
but it was hugely impactful for you.
Oh, massively.
I'm trying to just get a visceral, emotional sense of years of your life. In these symptoms.
Not being able to assemble sentences. I was.
Oh my goodness.
I have a law degree. I wrote, arguments for a living. To look at somebody and not remember their name. It wasn't like Alzheimer's, where it was like your wife and your kids, but to know people that I've known for a decade and look at them and say, I know you, but I don't know what your name is. I mean, it's not a nothing thing. It's a really serious.
Okay, but I interrupted you.
Yeah, no,
not
at all.
Yard having a difficult conversation with your wife.
Yeah, my wife and I sat down and said, our options are we can either sell our house,
right,
knowing that if you disclose you have a neurotoxin floating around inside, it's probably
you have to disclose
to take a hit on the value, to say the least. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, of course, we would never let anyone do that. We can try to remediate it, which in a lot of houses is really challenging, because you're effectively looking for something that's spitting out a toxin that can be anywhere. It can be inside of a wall. It can be under a floor. It can be, when you think about what you have to do to find a source, and we had a bunch of water leaks. We think we know what happened. We had things that homeowners all over America have happen all the time and probably think virtually nothing of. We had a pipe break a few years back, and we had a poorly installed remodel where a toilet the gray water was draining under our house. We had a AC drainage pipe that was.
So excuse me, keep going.
We had water coming in multiple places.
You had a condensate drain that was
dripping into a wall.
Oh, dripping into a wall.
Yeah.
That's
horrible.
Gallons of water.
Gallons of water over an unknown number of years. And, the problem with mold is that, it needs three things. It needs a source of food. It needs the right temperature range, 40 to 80 degrees, which is, most of the United States most of the year. And it needs spores. It needs some way to colonize. And, Austin, unfortunately, has a really high concentration of mold spores in the air. So mold finding its way into your house is kind of
a given.
It's going to happen.
Right, yeah. So the
but
spore tests are
totally
a sad joke. Don't
yeah,
test for spores, those of you listening. They're in your house.
You're going to get a positive. And then, when the way that we're building, the way we've built for decades and decades, unfortunately, for all the benefits we've gotten out of building fast, cheap, quick, lots of wood framing, lots of sheetrock, all these things that go up fast and look pretty and aren't that expensive, relatively speaking, comparatively, to stone and masonry and all these things we built buildings out of for centuries.
Built lightweight building assemblies here. Yeah.
Unfortunately, almost all of those products are really good substrates for mold to grow on.
Right.
They're literally mold food. Some of them are just like textbook what mold would want to eat.
Like the fast-growing pine.
Yeah, I mean, just they're what
paper on sheetrock.
Living things grow on. And, when you think about it, molds are like the world's smallest, most dangerous potential pest. It's like having mice.
Yeah.
But the problem is
microscopic mice.
You can't see them. Well, you can see them when they're growing on the outside of your walls, but most of the time they grow in environments that are kind of damp and inside and where you can't see them. And yet, the things they can do if they decide to spit out these mycotoxins, if it's that day, if you pick the wrong card, they can be really serious, as I'm kind of exhibit A of.
Yeah.
So when thinking about whether or not we could remediate it, we kind of thought through the logic and said we would, considering how many places water has gotten in over the years, a couple of roof leaks. Again, no major influx of flooding. Nothing that Hurricane Katrina would compare to. Tiny things, relatively small things that homes suffer the indignities of these intrusions all the time, all over the place. And I think people, because I was one of them, think, it dries out, it's fine. Maybe, if the floor is not going to rot away under my feet and I'm not going to put a boot through the upstairs roof, then this is going to be fine. It's just, this problem, unfortunately, I don't think is on the radar of the vast majority of people who own homes. And we don't get a owner's manual when you buy a house. You're not told to look for this stuff. We're not given a class in junior high school right after sex ed to say, hey, when you buy a home or you live in a home or you buy an apartment or you live in an apartment, these are the things you have to be aware of because they can really be serious. And it's not just a wall caving in; they can be serious to your health too.
Absolutely.
So we thought if we're gonna remediate, we're gonna tear this house apart to the studs. We're effectively gonna have to tear the house down if we're gonna have any confidence that we've gotten this toxin and the mold that's caused it out of it.
Was it a slab or a pier and beam?
It was a pier and beam house. So there was the other variable is that we have this whole underneath part, all of which can be a source. So when we thought about it, it was like we could easily spend six figures fishing around $50, $60, $80, $100,000 trying to find it. And then we will inevitably have to ask ourselves the question of how confident are we that we got it all? And where's our comfort level? I mean, we have a 3-year-old developmentally critical part of her life. We've already had her exposed to this stuff. Are we willing to do it again? We wanted to have another child. What environment do we want to raise him in? These are really hard, emotional, much less financial questions to grapple with. And we're on the front yard. Both of us are crying, recognizing that this asset, by far our biggest asset in the world financially, probably is going to just overnight became worth nothing. Yeah. Which is a devastating emotional and financial blow. On the flip side, the message of kind of hope that I've taken from that experience, even at that moment, was, okay, look, we know what the problem was that I've been suffering from. We know we have to solve it. We know that we can solve it. And what choice do we have?
Right. And you're not going to expose yourself to it knowingly anymore. So it's a choiceless, painful
It's situation. A painful choice. It's one of those moments you have an earthquake, everything falls down, you're in shock, and then you wake up and you have to do something about it. You have to move on with your life. So we may as well have had an earthquake. The problem is, unfortunately, based on the way insurance is run these days, this problem has the potential to be so widespread that I think most insurance companies are internally very aware of this as a risk. And so in Texas, at least, there's no mold coverage.
You said aware. They are aware of it.
Oh, look.
You believe so.
There's too much risk for them to
As
not be aware.
As a former lawyer.
Yeah, I mean, their actuaries are not doing their jobs if they are not pointing out the fact that if they cover for mold, and we know that we're building in this way, we know that water intrusions happen, and we know that there's a potential for this to cause harm, or at the very least to be something that's structurally problematic. If you covered mold problems, it would be a potential. The risk that insurance companies would be exposing themselves to would be enormous. And so, I know after the mold scare back in the 90s that started in Wimberley and moved to Houston, the Texas Attorney General negotiated with, farmers and State Farm and the other major Texas carriers of insurance providers to not make them include mold coverage in your standard policy. So you can get mold coverage, but it's a rider you have to buy. And usually it's 2 or 3 times what your house policy is. So no one buys it. I mean, who buys that? No one buys that. We didn't have it, of course. Wow. We called our wonderful insurance company. I mean, USA is a good company, and they basically laughed at us. They were like, "No, we aren't going to cover that. They'll cover some water damage, but that's a couple grand, and a couple of a new home. It's nothing." So we basically made the decision to tear our house down. We just ate it. We just ate the house, and.
That's an interesting podcast too, possibly the insurance angles, because I know that
it's
leaks. They'll fix the hole in your roof, but maybe not necessarily the water damage.
And really, in some ways, it's just as much on the medical side. It's not really their fault because the technology to test for mold is so imprecise, and it's so challenging to do that. It requires a real expert professional to get an actionable judgment that. The science hasn't gotten there yet. If the science gets there, if the technology gets there that lets people know what they have in their environment, there might be a groundswell of, grassroots consumer awareness that creates, some change at a legislative level that lets laws be written that requires insurance companies to cover that. But that's the action plan. That's what would have to happen. It'd be something like that. So when we started looking around for somebody to help us build a house that would never have that happen to it again. I mean, for us, it was very much mold specific. We don't want a house that will ever have mold. Okay, solve that problem. And we started looking around and asking around and talking to people who were in the building industry and people who were into healthy products. And there's some great stores in Austin that specialize in some of this stuff. Treehouse is a great place. There's a couple of EcoWise is awesome. Those guys are super smart. We said, who do you know that might be interested in helping us build this way? And it was just crickets. There was no one. There was no names. No one knew of a building company that would take this variable and make it the most important variable in the house. And for us, it was like, look, our house made us sick. So we don't want to get sick off our homes. So let's look at what we can build out of that will prevent that from happening. And when you start doing that, as a consumer, as a homeowner, what you start finding out is what I was talking about earlier, which is the way we're building, we as a civilization, as a society these days in the States, is not ideal when you're trying to avoid that problem. No. It's a really great way of building ineffective, good-looking houses that last as long as they need to until they're
like a movie
torn
set
down. It is, right.
Convince someone to sign this mortgage document and you've done your job.
It's awesome. It's a great. I love the movie set imagery because at some point it's just
Does
it's
it look
a
like
shell.
A house?
I know. But when we started digging in, just as consumers researching, we started getting really frustrated with the status quo and saying this is not the right way to do this because this problem is probably not isolated to us. We found out about it. We got lucky. I just fluke had a doctor who said, "Hey, you might have this problem, but for bumping into Ann Shippey, we would still be living in that home and still be sick as a dog, and I don't know if I'd be around anymore." So it was a fluke of life, but we took that awareness that we started getting about the flaws in the kind of how people are building and said, you know what, there must be a better way to do this. And so we started researching part by part of the house, the building envelope, what are we building out of? And
just on your
foundation,
own.
Yeah, absolutely. We started trying to figure it out. And we came across a couple of great resources. There's a really smart guy in Austin named George Swanson, who has a book called Breathable Walls.
That's a great book.
Great book, really was a Bible for us in a lot of ways. A number of other companies around the country that sell various parts of this, big chicken soup mix of a house that has all these various working pieces and, air barrier, water barrier, how do you do an HVAC system, what's your flooring made out of, your inside walls, your exterior sheathing, these words that, unless you're a contractor, you don't even really know what they mean.
Right.
Going through the process of self-educating and then looking at what the products that were out there and saying, all right, well, that won't help us or that won't do what we need it to do. And just piecemealing it together was a really interesting educational journey.
So you effectively turned yourself into a building science consultant.
I mean,
you could have Googled building science consulting.
Yeah. A very poor one, but we got far enough down the line to say, all right, we're comfortable that this way of doing it will prevent this problem for us. And so that methodology, we then tried to find someone to employ. And we couldn't. So we said, you know what? We'll do it ourselves. And we did. And so the house we built, I'd say is one of the healthiest houses you can build.
And I've been there, and I can say that it has a lot of fantastic qualities for no mold, good indoor air quality.
And we are constantly striving to improve that model. But, for us, this was such a personal story because it was this recognition that your house can make you sick that
absolutely.
We just never had.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's so many... You want to finish?
No.
There's so many different directions that I wanted to take this, that I've wanted to take it listening to you just then. I'm going to pick one right now, and I'm going to actually be a little humble and think about what I do, because we are a building science consulting shop, and, many people, when they find out about us, they say, oh, I didn't know a company like yours existed, and, wish I had. So you didn't know to Google building science consulting, but we do, and I'm not exaggerating, we do at least once a week. Moisture or mold consult. And it's not happy work.
Right.
Rarely, I've had a couple of times over the years, but rarely am I encountering a sick person. I'm usually encountering mold, visible mold, and it is public knowledge that, that's not good. And it is public knowledge that that's probably not good for my health. Like, I could be very allergic to that, or it could be problematic, not necessarily a neurotoxin. Or I'm just encountering a cupped hardwood or a stain of some sort, something like that. But the point being, when it is mold, since that seems to be the theme here, I do simplify, because keep in mind, I'm not seeing a sick homeowner, but I do simplify into, okay, look, so we have a mold problem. That means we have organic material that's exposed to moisture and air, because mold... we haven't said it yet, but I'll just give the brief overview. So mold is this amazing being that basically has an external stomach. And the way it eats is it lands on a surface, and then it kind of spits up onto the surface all these digestive enzymes, and then it starts slurping at the surface, the enzymes near it, and that creates a diffusion gradient, and the enzymes with the food now in it get drawn to it. And then eventually it grows strong enough that it sprouts these mycelium, these kind of like these antler things, and then when it gets a little more potent and strong from gathering this organic material from the surface, which, by the way, the organic material is the basis of all life on Earth, which is stored sunshine. It's these little stored molecules, these little stored chemical stores. But anyway, it spits up a bunch of mold spores, and it repeats it over and over and over, and eventually it's visible, and you can see it, and it's big enough. Okay, so that was the tangent on my narrative on the life cycle of mold. But the point is that I do tell people, look, so the answer is, we can't get rid of the surfaces in your house. Your house is in the air. We can't get rid of the spores, so we go after the moisture. And so if you control moisture effectively, and then and the podcast has been replete with them, there's myriad things to say about how to control moisture and why. So it actually shakes me, in my stomach, to realize I need to be... I don't want to fearmonger, but it's interesting to think about it. Is it appropriate to bring in a client's house on a consultation and say, how you feeling? Any symptoms? Any food allergies? Are you on Zyrtec by any chance? I actually don't think it's a good place to go to try to... I don't know. It's interesting.
Look, from a public health perspective, I think the way you look at this is to say, no public health official is going to show up and start doing an epidemiological survey and seeing what population's like, unless you have an ailment. There has to be something there.
Right.
And that's, I think, where we're at the very beginning of collecting data on this.
And low-grade ailments are everywhere.
That's the problem. It's how do you filter out what's what? Dr. Shippey, as one researcher, someone who sees sick people all the time, thinks that some of the most common autoimmune type diseases, asthma, chronic fatigue, these generalized catch-all type of biological body responses that might be caused by any one of a number of things, have this incredible commonality around mold exposure or mycotoxin exposure or indoor air environments. And I think what's challenging is that you really have two different things. You've got mold exposure, which, to your point, not all molds are bad, and or maybe you didn't say that, but I'll say that not all molds are bad. We've been living around molds for thousands of years. You can't say mold is bad in some dangerous way.
Right.
You don't
if we
want
got
it
rid
in
of
your
mold,
house.
that would be a big problem for the planet.
It'd be horrible. It would break down everything. We didn't have any biology.
Cycle.
Soil.
Very important
it's
cycle.
Important for life on Earth. But at the same time, it's this, again, going back, it's the indoor air part. It's this artificial environment that we've decided we are entitled to live in that for energy reasons is just tight enough to keep the conditioned airspace that we want at nice, comfortable 77 degrees inside, but not quite so tight that water can't find a way in. And when you combine that with the reality of what you said, which is that we're building out of so much stuff that's just organic food for mold, and mold does what you just so eloquently and beautifully described. When it reacts in that way, and it has food and it has a source of moisture and it has the right temperature to be doing all that, you're just rolling the dice. So from a public health point of view, what worries me is that I don't think we in the public health sector know to be looking for this. And in the medical world, where you would have to start with physicians diagnosing problems and having some idea or thought or instinct that mold might, or indoor air quality might be, or indoor air environments, whatever you're going to say, might have a causation or some sort of there might be a correlation between indoor air and this ailment. If doctors aren't being the ones that are saying, I wonder if you are feeling this way because of this, then public health officials are never going to be alerted to it. So this isn't on people's radar, unfortunately. And so I think, like, you walk into the proverbial client's house and they're called you there because of something they've seen or something structural or something that they're trying to change. You ask them if they're not feeling well, and so you have to run down the laundry list of what those potential poor feelings could be. And that requires an enormous amount of knowledge on your part, and being able to give them something that's not just a scary question you injected in their lives, but something that they actually might really have. So it's a kind of an unfortunate, very imprecise place we find ourselves in.
Absolutely.
That's caused in no small part by the environments that we're building. And I think a lack of recognition, especially in kind of the southern swath of the country where the climate is such that we don't open windows as much, and we're incredibly reliant on HVAC, on mechanical means of fresh air exchange and bringing fresh air in. Our house was built in 1938 and had a central air system, and probably when we
or central heat,
and both
turned into central air.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. When we moved in, had single pane windows that leaked like a sieve, so we replaced them with super tight, energy efficient, Danion windows,
decreasing the drying potential.
Absolutely, just made our whatever probably would eventually happen even worse. But
decreasing air exchange.
Absolutely. I mean, that's really the problem. This is a bizarrely recent technological
They call
problem.
it like a perfect storm, right?
So what do we do? I think that's kind of where I am. It's like, all right, well, most of the houses in America would probably qualify as being like that. A lot of them would.
Yes.
Just tight enough to where you're not going to get a lot of fresh air exchange. Whole parts of the country don't open windows enough. I mean, I was at a house up in upstate New York over the summer, and the windows were open day and night. I can't think of a day in the last 5 years that I've opened my windows in Austin day and night.
Right.
I just either too humid or too hot or too cold. It's just not that type of climate. We aren't used to that. It's not our culture even down here. We're so reliant on air conditioning that it's kind of the catch-all. You just assume you turn on the AC or the heater to make it temperate. So
and that is often the source of many of the health problems is the air conditioning system.
So part of what I get really fired up about is marching down this road of us as almost a species or a society feeling like we're entitled to be comfortable without, and I don't mean to indict anybody in this process, but without taking into account the potential risks of that desire, of that need.
Exactly.
If we all lived in teepees still, this wouldn't be a problem. Or yurts.
Right.
Or, igloos. I mean, this is a modern problem. So, like so many other things when technology gets into play, I mean, here it's building technology at the end of the day, but technology always gives you a choice as to whether or not you want to use it. Do you want to get the x-ray? You have to weigh the cost. I'm going to get some radiation, but I'm going to get some results. Do I want to fly in the plane? I'm going to
get to New York faster.
Get to New York faster, but there's a risk of falling from 40,000 feet. It's a very low risk, but it's catastrophic if it happens to be my unlucky day. But here,
right. You're taking a risk that you do not know you're taking.
Yeah, and that's the problem. It's an uninformed risk. And when you think about it from a risk management perspective, my kind of mission or passion or what I've just experienced and makes me want to help the world in this way is to say, look, guys, all of us guys, let's maybe rethink what we're building, how we're building it, what we're building out of, and minimize the risks of anything going wrong. And recognize that indoor air is just as important as, clean water and healthy food.
Right, exactly.
It is just as important to our health and well-being. And if you create an environment, if you start thinking about your house like the International Space Station, to where they don't have a choice, that has to be clean air because the outside is going to kill them. If you think about your indoor airspace, I think your home like that, and you just walk inside your home tonight and you say, all right, how good is my air and what's affecting my air? What can I do to make the air in here cleaner? Because that will not only make me healthy, but minimize the risk of a harm.
Right.
That's a really great way to think about this structure that we're living in. And, I think that the built environment has the potential to be the next big public health, the next big space.
I agree completely. And just try to start to wrap up. Actually, the wrapping up is challenging because you brought up George Swanson, which brings up magnesium oxide.
Right.
Which we're not going to cover that for today. There's so much. So I think I'd like to have you back on if you're willing.
Sure, I'd love to come.
But two things real quick. One is, right where you're sitting, about a week ago, Dr. Allison Bales, Energy Vanguard, was sitting there, and we were discussing ventilation. And why were we discussing ventilation? Obviously for human health, human factors. And one of the glaring features of the great ventilation debate, which is occurring right now, with a lot more emotion and vitriol than most people would probably think in the engineering world, but is that there is a profound lack of epidemiological studies supporting different ventilation standards. And yet, prudence is still bearing out. You should ventilate, you should do it effectively. But the bigger thing that you're touching on, and it's just uncanny to me how similar our worldviews are. And those of you listening, we pretty much just met randomly about a month ago or 2 months ago and just got together again today. So we would like to, you and I, and I really believe we're going to be making this happen in the months and years ahead, to expand the discussion between those of us interested in the building sciences with those of us also who are interested in the biological sciences. Right. And there's a bit of a distortion, right? So right now, we do mechanical designs for high-performance buildings. Right. And when you think high performance, you obviously think comfort, and you think energy efficiency, and you want it to be durable. We as a company, we like to talk about human-factored building design, we like to talk about health, but if you think about it, when you talk about any endeavor, there are fundamental organizing principles that you use to decide, is this good or bad? So energy, obviously, it's going to steer you down the route of how to build a house, and durability is going to steer you down a lot of moisture control, the discussions, and comfort is going to have a lot of impacts. But this health one, I think it needs to go to the top. Like, given that the house is healthy and comfortable, it needs to last a long time, and then use as little energy as possible in achieving those goals. So it's kind of like, instead of energy efficiency, we as a society, we as people, we like to say, what's the ROI on that? Right? Well, what's the ROI on not getting sick? How do you calculate that?
It's a lot like food. I mean, when you look at what's happened in the food industry in a grocery in the last 30 or 35 years, organic kale wasn't available 35 years ago at your local corner store. It just wasn't. And now it's amazing how these words, organic and sustainable and local, all of these attributes that we're applying to our food are now just part of the discourse. And I think that people have become so much more aware about what they're putting in their mouths, and they're being more skeptical, and they're reading labels more.
Interesting.
And we're trying to see better food labels being put out by the government, or better food labeling requirements, so that consumers can make an informed choice about their health as far as food and nutrition is involved. But there's so many analogies to that.
So they're sitting in their kitchen reading this label, ingesting
the fruit loops or whatever it is. I mean, who never knows what it is? But the awareness that what you eat affects your health in such a profound way is what spawned the whole rise in organic foods and the incredible growth that part of the sector has seen, much to Whole Foods' deep chagrin, as Walmart and Target are now selling organic food just as much as they are, and it's really taken their market share. But
I didn't know that.
In the food in the food space, that's a consumer driven awareness. People are wanting to buy better quality, healthier stuff, but that's not because it's sourced in a better way, or the people that are growing it or farming it are paid better. It's because they think it's healthier. And so the driving force of it is self-interest in preserving oneself and living a longer, healthier life. And so how easy is it to have that same conversation around building?
Absolutely.
We just need to start.
Absolutely.
There needs to be more of that. And it should, to your point, you said it so well, it should be a variable that goes to the top. Not because one person in 100 or 1,000, or we don't even know, might get sick from their homes or is sick from their homes. But shouldn't we just try to all build in a way that takes health into account so that this doesn't happen? And if that doesn't cost any more, or it's like organic kale versus conventional, maybe it's 10% more. If the trade-off is, you know what, it's an insurance policy against your house ever having anything happen to it that might cause harm. Those of us that work in this field who give advice to people who don't know, and it's hard to feel it's so complex, it's hard to research. Those of all of us who do this, I think, have a responsibility to kind of lead this charge.
Absolutely.
Because the consumer, this is going to be a really tough consumer movement to get from there. Unless 60 Minutes has a piece tomorrow on the potential for this, and all of a sudden everyone's asking for better quality, healthier buildings. People in the building sciences space need to collaborate with people in the medical sciences space and the biological sciences space and do more research and come up with better studies that let us know how much of a problem this is, what we need to be worried about, how extensive it is, and what we can do to fix it, and what we can do to build better. So I think that's great work, and that's a worthy endeavor for us to pursue and others as well.
Absolutely. Well, very well said. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for listening. We'll talk to you next time.